It was the night of October 6th, 1943, and the waters off the Solomon Islands were black as ink. The Japanese destroyer Yugure cruised steadily through the channel, her crew relaxed, cigarettes glowing faintly in the dark. To them, this was just another Tokyo Express run a routine supply dash under cover of night. The war had taught them to fear American bombers and submarines, not small wooden boats. But that confidence was about to shatter. At 12:10 a.m., a faint blip appeared on the ship's radar, small, fast, erratic. The officer of the watch squinted. Probably debris, someone murmured. The South Pacific was full of wreckage, after all. But seconds later, that debris moved against the current, accelerating. Then came the first glimpse. 3 white wakes cutting through the black water, slicing toward the destroyer like ghostly claws. "Torpedoes!" the lookout screamed. Chaos erupted. Searchlights flared, engines roared, and anti-aircraft guns swiveled downward, firing blindly into the darkness. The destroyer's crew, trained for fleet engagements against cruisers and subs, suddenly faced something they had never prepared for: an enemy that attacked from the shadows at 40 knots, faster than any ship they had ever seen. Within 90 seconds, the sea became fire. Explosions tore through the night. Yugure's bow lifted, her hull split apart, and in moments she was gone. Men clung to debris in stunned silence, staring into the void. Their attackers had already vanished, unseen, unheard, invisible. Those attackers were not cruisers or submarines. They were PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, 80-foot wooden craft powered by raw American ingenuity and the reckless courage of 12-man crews. To the Japanese, these had been mosquitoes, mere irritants unworthy of attention. But that night, the mosquitoes bit hard. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years perfecting its doctrine of steel, armor, and firepower. Yet, none of that mattered when a wooden boat, powered by racing engines and sheer nerve, could strike from the dark and disappear before the guns could even traverse. That night in Iron Bottom Sound marked more than a single victory. It was the beginning of a new kind of naval warfare where speed, stealth, and adaptability replaced armor and pride. The sea had changed forever. In the early months of 1942, the Pacific Ocean had turned into a vast graveyard of steel. American cruisers and destroyers, built for the open sea, were fighting a war of islands, reefs, and jungle shorelines. Every engagement seemed to reveal the same flaw: ships, too large, too deep-drafted, and too slow to maneuver in the shallow waters that defined the new front. The Navy's might was immense on paper, but on the ground, or rather, in the lagoons, it was clumsy, exposed, and blind. What the Pacific demanded was something completely different, not another battleship, but a ghost. A small, fast vessel that could dart through the shallows, deliver a crippling blow, and vanish before enemy gunners could react. A weapon of ambush and speed. But in 1942, the very idea of such a craft sounded like heresy to traditional naval minds. Still, the Navy's Bureau of Ships issued a desperate call to America's private shipbuilders. They wanted an experimental class of patrol torpedo boats, light, cheap, and fast enough to evade a destroyer. 2 companies answered the challenge: Higgins Industries of New Orleans and Elco, the electric launch company of Bayonne, New Jersey. Both began experimenting with wooden hulls, not because of preference, but necessity. Steel was precious, reserved for the Navy's giants. Wood, however, was plentiful, easy to shape, and lighter than anything else afloat. The first prototypes were fast, yes, but fragile. At full throttle, the hulls shuddered violently. Salt water soaked the planks. Torpedoes misfired, mounts jammed, and the small crews found themselves battling the elements as much as the enemy. To most admirals, it was proof that the concept was doomed. Toys, one officer sneered, fit for yacht clubs, not warfare. But others saw potential. These boats could reach enemy positions where destroyers couldn't go. They could hide behind islands, attack under cover of darkness, and harass supply convoys with torpedoes that could cripple ships 100 times their size. The Navy approved limited production. Dozens of these new PT boats began rolling off the lines at Higgins and Elko, each one an experiment, each one a risk. The crews who volunteered to serve aboard them were told the same thing. You're on your own out there. They didn't yet know it, but those fragile hulls would soon rewrite the rules of naval combat. The first generation of PT boats looked fast, sleek hulls, narrow beams, and a predatory silhouette, but they lacked one thing: power. Their early engines were marine, conversions of aircraft models, prone to overheating, coughing smoke, and sputtering out when pushed too hard. On the calm waters of testing grounds, they looked impressive. In the Pacific, they were death traps. When chased by Japanese destroyers, most PT boats barely reached 30 knots. For a craft built to strike and flee, that was fatal. Then came the game-changer Packard Motor Company of Detroit. Known for building engines that powered luxury cars and racing champions, Packard was about to turn speed into a weapon. Engineers were tasked with creating a marine engine that could survive the salt, heat, and vibration of war, and deliver more horsepower than anything that size had ever achieved. The result was a monster, a 12-cylinder marine engine capable of 1,350 horsepower. Now imagine 3 of them mounted side by side inside an 80-foot wooden hull. Combined, they unleashed more than 4,000 horsepower, roaring through the night like a pack of unleashed predators. The vibrations alone could rattle bolts loose, and when throttled to maximum output, the entire deck hummed like a living thing. The PT boats could now hit 41 knots faster than any Japanese destroyer, faster even than the torpedoes they launched. But speed came at a price. The hulls were still wood-layered mahogany planking, sealed with glue and faith. The men who manned them soon coined a grim nickname: plywood coffins. One tracer round could ignite the fuel lines. A near miss from a 5-inch shell could shatter the hull. The boats carried no armor, no real protection. Just speed, agility, and the nerve of the 12-man crew. Yet the crews loved their machines. Each PT boat was a hand-built racer, a thoroughbred of war. Crews tuned their engines like mechanics before a Grand Prix, wringing every bit of power from their Packard hearts. By day, the Navy's destroyers ruled. But by night, these wooden rockets began to take over the Pacific's narrow channels. They were invisible, unpredictable, and dangerously fast. The plywood coffin had found its soul and its teeth. In 1942, pride was the beating heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Theirs was a fleet born from the legacy of Tsushima, where Japanese gunnery and seamanship had once humiliated the Russian Empire. Every destroyer captain carried that history like a badge of honor. Their doctrine revolved around power long-range torpedoes, armor plating, and the dream of a decisive battle that would crush America in one glorious stroke. Against that steel tradition, the idea of an American wooden torpedo boat seemed laughable. Japanese intelligence reports described the PTs as fragile, unreliable, and clumsy. Some captains joked that they were floating matchsticks. Others compared them to mosquitoes, annoying but harmless. When early encounters with PT squadrons ended in failure, the laughter only grew louder. To the Japanese, these little boats were nothing more than desperate experiments from an overconfident enemy. But the laughter didn't last long. The Americans were learning fast. Every failed mission became a classroom. Every wrecked PT boat taught a new tactic. By the end of 1942, the men of the PT squadrons had developed a terrifyingly effective method of night combat. They hunted in teams. One boat would light up the horizon with tracer fire, drawing the attention of Japanese guns, while a second circled unseen in the dark, lining up a torpedo shot from the flank. When the enemy adjusted its guns, the Americans vanished into the night, engines throttled down, waiting for the next opening. Suddenly, the Japanese Navy's great advantage, its discipline and doctrine, became its weakness. Their destroyers were built for visibility, for formation combat under command. Against small, independent hunters that attacked in chaos, that discipline collapsed. Gun crews hesitated. Radar operators grew frantic, and by the time searchlights found their mark, the attackers were gone. The Japanese began to realize something they'd never anticipated. Speed was not a nuisance, it was a weapon. These mosquitoes could hit, vanish, and strike again before dawn. Their hit-and-run attacks disrupted the Tokyo Express convoys, forced destroyers to zigzag through narrow channels, and drained precious fuel and time. What Japan dismissed as weakness, light hulls, improvisation, unorthodox tactics, became the very traits that turned the tide of the night war. The laughter faded. In its place came unease. The Imperial Navy, masters of the decisive battle, had met an enemy that refused to fight by their rules. The waters off the Solomon Islands were known by a grim name, Iron Bottom Sound. Beneath those waves lay the bones of warships from both sides, their twisted hulls resting in silence. On the night of October 6, 1943, 4 American PT boats waited there in ambush: PT-59, PT-157, PT-162, and PT-170. Their mission was simple: intercept the Tokyo Express, the Imperial Navy's high-speed supply convoys, feeding Japan's garrisons across the island chain. The night was heavy with humidity, the sea black as oil. The men spoke in whispers, sweat dripping down their faces as they crouched over radar screens and throttles. Their engines idled quietly, ready to roar. At just past midnight, faint echoes began to appear on the radar scopes, multiple fast-moving signatures, closing in from the north. Destroyers, big ones. The PT captains exchanged quick radio messages, their voices low and calm despite the pounding of their hearts. Each man knew the odds. Against armor and 5-inch guns, they were little more than splinters. But that was their advantage. The Japanese didn't believe anyone would dare to attack them head-on. As the destroyers entered the channel, their searchlights cut through the dark like swords. The PT boats accelerated 35 knots, then 40. Their Packard engines howled, the air filled with the sharp stench of burning fuel. At 1,000 yards, PT-170 unleashed 2 torpedoes, followed by PT-162 moments later. The wakes of the torpedoes glowed faintly under the moonlight as the men watched in tense silence. Then a blinding flash, a roar that split the night apart. The Japanese destroyer Yugur, 2,900 tons of steel and pride, erupted in a pillar of fire. The explosion tore her in half. Within minutes, she was gone. For the first time in naval history, a wooden boat had destroyed a fully armed destroyer in open combat. The American crews sped away into the darkness, vanishing before the enemy could even return fire. Back in Tokyo, disbelief turned to alarm. Reports confirmed what seemed impossible. Plywood and gasoline had defeated steel and discipline. That night shattered a doctrine decade in the making. From then on, Japanese destroyer captains no longer laughed when they saw strange blips on their radar screens. They feared them. The destruction of the Yugur sent shockwaves across the Imperial Navy. The once proud Tokyo Express, the lifeline connecting Japan's island garrisons, was suddenly haunted by ghosts that moved faster than fear itself. Every radar blip, every flash of foam on a dark wave, could be a PT boat waiting to strike. The Pacific night, once a shield for Japanese destroyers, had turned against them. After October 6, 1943, everything changed. Convoys began sailing farther from the islands, taking longer, riskier routes. Some captains refused to run the channels at night without heavy escort. The pressure on supply lines was relentless. On isolated islands from New Georgia to Kolombangara, Japanese troops began to run out of ammunition, fuel, and food. Starvation became as deadly as any American bullet, and at the heart of this strangulation were the small wooden boats the Japanese had once mocked. The PT boats were not unstoppable. They took losses, often catastrophic ones, but they forced the enemy to adapt. In doing so, they changed the rhythm of the war itself. Every ton of steel that Japan lost to these wooden hunters weakened its empire's reach. Each ambush forced Tokyo's strategists to rethink how to fight an enemy that valued speed over armor, chaos over control. In truth, the PT boats were more than weapons. They were symbols of what American industry and improvisation could achieve under pressure. Built from wood, powered by car engines, and crewed by men barely out of their teens, they embodied the raw ingenuity of a nation learning to fight differently. They showed that war wasn't only won by size or firepower, but by adaptability, the willingness to break rules and invent new ones in the heat of battle. For the men who served aboard them, survival depended on trust, reflex, and sheer nerve. Many didn't make it home, but those who did carried a quiet pride. They hadn't just fought the enemy, they had rewritten the definition of naval warfare. By the end of the Pacific Campaign, Japanese commanders no longer measured threats by tonnage or caliber. They measured them by speed and by the fear that a wooden blur, moving at 40 knots, might be waiting in the dark. The age of the giant had ended. The age of the fast had begun. When dawn rose over the Solomon Islands after that fateful night in 1943, the ocean looked calm again. The waves rolled gently, hiding the wrecks beneath, but history had shifted beneath that surface. The Yuga's twisted hull resting on the seabed was more than a casualty. It was a monument to a new kind of warfare. The patrol torpedo boats were never meant to win the war alone. They were too small, too fragile, too lightly armed. But their impact went far beyond their size. They represented something elemental, the idea that ingenuity could overcome might, that courage could outpace convention. Against the Imperial Japanese Navy's obsession with massive ships and decisive battles, the PT boats brought a new philosophy. Strike fast, strike smart, and never fight the same fight twice. Their crews were ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances, mechanics, fishermen, and factory boys turned warriors of the night. They fought not for glory, but for survival and purpose. They navigated by instinct, trusted their machines, and learned to use darkness itself as a weapon. Each mission was a gamble, each return to base, a small miracle. Yet their success proved a truth that still echoes through military history. Innovation isn't born in safety, it's forged in desperation. The Japanese destroyer captains, once arrogant in their armor and experience, would spend the remainder of the war glancing nervously at their radar screens, knowing that speed had become a greater enemy than firepower. The PT boat's wake rippled through naval strategy for decades afterward, influencing everything from fast attack craft to missile boats and even the tactics of modern naval special operations. In the end, what remains most remarkable is not the number of ships they sank, but the fear they created, the doubt they sowed in an enemy that once believed itself untouchable. The PT boats proved that the sea, like war itself, doesn't belong to the biggest or the strongest. It belongs to those who adapt the fastest. Under the moonlight of the Pacific, those wooden hulls cut their white trails across history, brief, shining, unstoppable. The smallest boats left the deepest wakes,